The stone walls on the Pike place had been written off by every farmer who ever drove past them. They ran the hillside in long gray lines, up over the high pasture, down through the sugar bush, along the north edge where the ground fell away toward the brook. By the fall of 1985, there was not another standing wall left in that whole stretch of Cheshire County, New Hampshire. The rest had come down, sold, buried, pushed into the tree line, forgotten. Every farmer in the hills above Nelson had looked at his own walls and reached the same sensible conclusion. Every farmer except one. Warren Pike left his exactly where they stood. People thought he was slow. Some thought he was stubborn. A few thought he was too soft-hearted to run a hill farm the way a hill farm needed running. And they weren't cruel about it. They were only certain. He let them stay certain. He had made a promise to a dead man, and he meant to keep it. This is the story of what those walls turned out to be. This is a channel for the people who remember that kind of promise. Stories like this don't get told much anymore. If you were raised around folks who worked with their hands and never made a speech about any of it, take a second right now and subscribe. We'll keep telling them for as long as you're willing to sit and listen. Warren was 37 that fall. The farm sat at the top of a town road above Nelson, 140 acres of hill ground his family had worked since 1841. It was hard land. Thin soil over granite, more rock than dirt in most of it. The kind of ground that heaves a fresh crop of stones up out of itself every spring, like the hill is still trying to be rid of them. October came in cold and bright. The maples along the wall lines had already gone by, and the smell in the air was wood smoke and wet leaves, and the first hard frost sitting white on the pasture grass at dawn. Down in the valley, the bigger operations were finishing a clean third cut on fields you could land a plane on. Up on Warren's Hill there was one man, one old Ford tractor, one dog that wouldn't leave his heel, and better than 10 miles of stone wall that everybody but him had already decided was garbage. He fed his stock in the dark and did his walls no favors and no harm. And the county left him mostly alone. The way it leaves a man alone once it has quietly agreed he is a little bit lost. The pulling had started 4 years before that, around 1981. A man named Royce Denton, out of Keene, had figured out that the old hand-laid wall stone the farmers all cursed was worth real money to the people building summer houses down along the seacoast and over in the lake country. Round, weathered, gray with 150 years of lichen grown into it. You could not buy that new at any price. Denton would come up a farm road with a flatbed and a case loader and pay cash by the ton. For a lot of those hill farmers, that stone was the first easy money the land had ever handed them. Harlan Bede, whose place ran along Warren's east line, sold every foot of wall he owned in the spring of 1983. Cleared better than $9,000 off rock he'd spent his whole life plowing around and swearing at. He bought a used New Holland baler with the money and told Warren, friendly enough, that he'd been a fool not to do it years sooner. Denton came to Warren twice. The first time he did the math right out loud on the hood of his truck. Warren had close to 11 miles of wall. At the going rate, Denton figured it somewhere north of $40,000, and this was 1985. When $40,000 would have cleared most of what Warren still owed the bank down in Keene. Warren listened to the whole pitch. He was polite about it. Then he said no. Denton thought he had misheard and said the number again. Slower, the way you'd say it to a child. Warren said no the same quiet way and offered the man a cup of coffee, which Denton did not take. Word got around the way word does. Pike turned down $40,000 for a pile of rocks. There's a man, they said, who cannot get out of his own way. And so the walls came down all over that country, all through the middle 80s, and it happened so gradual that hardly anybody stopped to notice a thing was passing. You would drive the town roads in the fall and there'd be one more gap where a run of stone had stood the week before. One more field opened up wide and clean and modern. One more 150 years of a family's stooped labor loaded onto a flatbed and gone down the road to Keene. Nobody grieved it. There was no reason to. The money was good, and the fields were better, and the work was finally, mercifully easier. A man would be a sentimental fool to stand in the way of that. Only Warren stood in the way of it, up on his hill, doing nothing, saying nothing, keeping his word to a man in the ground. There was a second cost to those walls, and it had nothing to do with the price of stone. They cut Warren's ground into small, awkward pieces. Where the neighbors had opened their hillsides into long, clean fields, a modern tractor could swing through without ever lifting the implement. Warren still farmed the way his people had in 1900, around the walls, inside them, in fields you could throw a stone clear across. Every man in the county understood what that meant. It meant wasted headland at every single wall. It meant hours lost turning where you shouldn't have to turn. It meant you could not run the big equipment that was the only thing making a hill farm pay anymore. And everyone knew a hill farm barely paid as it was. The extension man, a decent fellow named Paul Grady, drove up one spring with a folder of charts and sat at Warren's kitchen table and showed him, kindly, gently, that he was leaving money in the ground on every acre he owned. Warren looked at the charts a long while. He said Grady was probably right about the money. Then he said the walls were staying, and that he could not fully explain to another person why, and that he knew exactly how that sounded coming out of his mouth. Not stubborn, exactly. Just settled. Like a man who has already had the whole argument years ago with somebody who is no longer around to finish it. What nobody knew was that Warren spent time on those walls that had nothing to do with keeping them neat. Most winters, on the still days after a thaw, he walked them. All of them. He would start at the barn and follow the northeast run down toward the brook, then cut back up along the high pasture line, and he would stop here and there, for no reason a person watching could ever have named. He would lay his bare hand flat against one particular stone and hold it there. He would study the way the ground lay below the wall, whether it ran greener there, whether the snow had gone off sooner on one side than the other, whether the frost heaved one course and left the next alone. He carried a small spiral notebook in his coat, and now and then he would write something in it, a few words, a date, a mark, and put it back. Harlan Bede, cutting firewood one February across the property line, watched him do it and could not make sense of any of it. Warren wasn't fixing anything. He wasn't clearing brush off the stone. He was walking the wall slow and stopping and standing with his hand on it, the way you'd stand with an animal you were worried about. Harlan hollered over and asked him what in the world he was doing out there in the cold. Warren thought about it a good long moment. "Water," he said finally, listening for the water. Harlan let it drop. Figured Pike had gone a little strange living up there by himself. He did not think about it again for 30 years. To understand what Warren was listening for, you have to go back to the man who taught him to listen. His grandfather, Elias Pike, born on that hill in 1891, dead in the spring of 1970, buried in the town cemetery under a stone he had cut and squared with his own hands. Elias had known that farm the way a man knows the inside of his own palm. He had not built the walls himself. They'd been laid by his grandfather and the ones before him, back when clearing the field and stacking the stone were the same single act of work. But Elias understood them better than the men who set them, because he had spent 70 years watching what they did. When Warren was a boy, no more than 8 or 9, Elias would take him out along the walls in the gray early morning and make him put his hand flat on the stone. "Feel that," he'd say. That's cold coming off the water. Elias could stand at the top of that hill in a dry August and tell you, without ever putting a spade in the ground, where the soil still held moisture and where it would burn off first. And he was never once wrong. And the walls were how he knew. The old men who cleared that hill had not stacked the stone just anywhere it was handy. They had laid the heaviest, oldest runs along the seams where the water moved under the ground, along the contour of the slope, across the path of the hardest winter wind. A wall is not a fence, but that was the thing Elias said more than any other thing. So often that Warren heard it in his sleep for years after the old man was gone. A wall is not a fence. A wall is 100 years of paying attention, stacked up plain where a man who cared to could read it. The last thing Elias asked of him, near the end, in the front room with the shades pulled halfway down against the light, was a promise. Don't ever let them take the northeast run. Warren was 22. He gave his word. Then his grandfather was gone, and Warren had a whole lifetime ahead of him to wonder whether he'd promised out of good hard sense or only out of love. For a long time, if you'd asked him straight, he honestly could not have told you which. Here is what the old men knew, and what the modern maps and the big tractors had let everybody forget. On a hill like that one, the walls were doing 3 jobs at once. The lowest runs, down along the brook and across the flat ground, sat right on top of the natural seeps, the places where groundwater rose close to the surface, and the packed stone slowed that water and spread it sideways under the field instead of letting it run straight off the hill and away. The runs up along the high pasture broke the northwest wind that otherwise came over the ridge all winter and stripped the snow cover clean off the grass, so that behind Warren's walls the snow lay deep and even and melted slow into the ground for weeks after the open fields had already dried out. And every wall, everywhere, was a wall of stone holding a hill in place. When it rained hard, the neighbors' long, clean fields shed the water in sheets, and the topsoil went with it. A little more every storm, year after year, down into the ditches and gone for good. Warren's ground stayed put. The walls caught it and held it. Nobody had ever drawn a bit of this up on paper. It had been learned the slow way over 6 or 7 generations by men who could not afford to be wrong twice about the same thing. And then it had been written down in the only language those men fully trusted, which was stone. The proof came in the summer of 2016, and it came the hard way, the way proof usually comes on a farm. That was the year the rain quit. All across southern New Hampshire, the wells began dropping in June. By August, the Monadnock country was in the worst drought anyone under 60 could remember standing through. Cheshire County went to extreme on the government map, the dark red color, and it stayed there week after week. The lawns went first, then the gardens, then the pastures. Ponds that had never once been dry in living memory pulled back off their banks and cracked open down the middle like old plates left in the sun. Wells that families had drunk from for 40 years came up with air and grit and a smell of iron. Down in the valley, the big operations watched a third cut fail, then a second, and started hauling water in and selling off cattle they had no way left to feed. Harlan Bede's spring, the one he had counted on his whole long life, went to a trickle in July and then to nothing at all in August. And Harlan, who was past 80 by then and stooped over a cane, stood out in his dooryard and watched his pasture turn the flat brown color of a paper bag. Warren was 68 that summer. He walked his walls in August the way he'd walked them for 50 years. But this time, he was looking for one thing only, and he was afraid of what he might find. He went down the northeast run, the one his grandfather had made him swear to keep, the lowest and oldest wall on the whole place, down where the ground fell toward the brook. The brook itself was dry, bone dry, white stones and gray dust. but the ground along the foot of that wall was dark. He knelt down in it. He laid his hand flat against the bottom course the way Elias had first shown him when he was 8 years old. And the stone was cold. Cold, coming off the water. He worked a few of the smaller stones loose at the base of the wall, in the exact spot he had marked in his notebook 100 times over the years, without ever quite letting himself believe it. And underneath, in a little hollow, the old men had walled in on purpose and covered over. The water was still moving, a slow, steady seep, running clear. In the driest August that hill had seen in 100 years. His grandfather had known it would be right there, had walled it to keep it, had set one flat capstone above it with a single line scratched across the face, a mark Warren had run his thumb across 10,000 times and never once understood until that morning, kneeling in the dust. It marked the water. The whole wall marked the water. Every foot of stone on that entire hillside was a map, and he had been standing on it his whole life, and it had gone on keeping its promise long after the man who made it was in the ground. He didn't say a word to anyone at first. He just started carrying water in a barrel on the back of the old Ford, up from the seep to his stock tank, twice a day, every day. Then Harlan came over. Harlan Bede, who had sold every last wall he owned in 1983 for $9,000 and a used baler, walked the line between the two farms and stood there a long, long time, taking in the difference. On his own side, dust. On Warren's side, behind the walls, grass. Not the green of June, but alive. Alive when nothing else on the hill was. Harlan didn't say "I told you so," because he never had, and he didn't say much of anything at all. He just asked, quiet, whether there was water. Warren told him there was. "Enough to share," he said. "Come on up." By the end of that summer, Warren Pike was the only man on that whole hill with water. And word of it traveled the way word of the walls had traveled 30 years before. Only this time it traveled the other direction. His pasture held. His small, awkward fields, the ones the extension man had charted out as a loss on every acre, carried his cattle clear through to fall on grass the walls had kept alive. He shared the seep with Harlan and with 2 other families down the road, hauling barrels twice a day on the old Ford until the rains finally came back in the middle of October. Nobody laughed about the walls after that. There was a second kind of accounting, too, though Warren never cared much for it. That old hand-laid stone Royce Denton had offered $40,000 for back in 1985 had only climbed since. By 2016, reclaimed New England wall stone was selling to the builders down south for as much as $100 a running foot, and Warren had close to 11 miles of it. 11 miles, better than 58,000 feet. Sitting up on his hillside, quietly doing its slow work. On paper, the walls were worth more than the farm. More than the farm had earned in a century of hay and milk and sweat and mud. He never sold a single foot of it. When people asked him why not, he'd tell them the stone wasn't for selling. The stone was working. They started coming up the hill to find him after that dry summer. Young people mostly. Some of them farming their own ground, some of them just trying to get back hold of something they felt in their bones they had lost. He'd take them out along the northeast run in the early morning and make them put a bare hand flat on the stone. "Feel that," he'd say. "That's cold coming off the water." He is in his late 70s now. He still walks the walls on the still days after a thaw. He still carries the little notebook in his coat. And he still tells the young ones the same thing his grandfather told him. Told him so many times he heard it in his sleep. A wall is not a fence. Harlan Bede is gone now too. But before he went, he told this story to anybody who would sit still long enough to hear it, always the same way, always ending on the same note. He'd say the difference between him and Warren Pike was never brains. and it was never luck. He'd say the difference was that Warren had believed a dead man about something he could not see with his own eyes, and had kept faith with it through 50 years of being called a fool, and had turned out right in the one single year it mattered. The old men who stacked that stone had been building for a grandson they would never live to meet, against a dry year they would never live to see. That is the whole of it, really. They laid up what they knew, plain and heavy and true, in the only language that outlasts the man who speaks it. And 100 years on, when the wells failed and the ponds cracked open and the fields all burned to paper, the water was still there in the wall, right where they said it would be, waiting on the one man patient enough to leave it standing.